Could everyone take a seat, please? We're going to get started again.
Good afternoon. I'm Rich Hobbie, Executive Director of the National Association of State Workforce Agencies and a longtime member of the Academy. I've been drafted to substitute for Janice Natoli, who could not make it here. She's stuck in the weather in New York City. This session is entitled, do I have the title here? Strengthening Unemployment Insurance, Promising Solutions to Systemic Problems. We have three panelists. One panelist also could not make it due to the weather. Andrew Stetner, Deputy Director for the National Employment Law Project. I think Andrew might be in New York City also. Yes, he is. Okay. Our first panelist, and they will speak in the order as introduced, is Gary Burtless, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he also holds the Whitehead Chair in Economic Studies at Brookings. I remember when I worked for the House Committee on Ways and Means in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and one of my duties was to find economists to testify on unemployment insurance. And I can tell you Gary was always at the top of the list and always did a fantastic job. So I thank you for that, Gary, over the years. I used to call him on Thursday for testifying on Tuesday, and Gary would always sound a little reluctant, but he would always come through with really great testimony. Kevin Hassett is with the American Enterprise Institute, and he is a senior fellow there and director of economic policy studies. Anyone who follows economics in Washington knows about Kevin and his work. And then finally we have Andrew Grant Thomas, who is Deputy Director of the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University. We will begin with Gary.
Now bear in mind that when you're called on a Thursday or Friday to testify the following Tuesday, it usually means a terrible weekend. Unless you already know a lot about the subject, which I rarely did when I would have to spend the weekend tracking down all these data from the BLS and from the Labor Department, and so it was always a very unenjoyable weekend after I got those phone calls. Now, other speakers are going to talk about desirable UI reforms and benefits in duration and eligibility in light of the very severe recession and show how we can do things better in the future. I have views on those subjects too, but I'd like to propose a change in a very little known aspect of the unemployment program, namely the way we tax employers to pay for the system. My remarks should be very easy to remember because it's a very, very simple change that I'm proposing, and my basic argument can be stated very simply. The UI payroll tax is imposed on a taxable wage base that's way too small. And this means that the UI tax itself is too regressive compared with what an optimal tax would be that paid for the same program. And the low wage base means that the poorest wage earners face the maximum UI tax in many states. It also means that wages subject to UI taxes increase more slowly than the earnings that are insured by the program, meaning that typically the revenues are going to increase more slowly than the earnings that are being insured. And in turn, the anemic growth in the earnings subject to the tax slows the growth of revenues raised by this tax, which hurts state trust fund reserves, makes them less prepared whenever we have a serious recession, and it forces state legislatures to increase the tax rate that they impose on that very narrow wage base, which makes the tax even more regressive. UI payroll tax is now a poll tax on jobs in most states. It discourages employers from adding workers to the payroll and encourages them to add hours to the work week of the people that they already have on their payroll. If they add to their payroll, they increase their UI tax liability. If instead they add to the hours of their existing workforce, they do not. My basic recommendation, very simple to remember. The federal UI wage base should be increased to 1/2 the Social Security wage base, i.e. it should be raised to about $53,000, and states should be forced to follow suit. Now, most of you know that employers must pay a statutory UI tax for each of their employees. They pay this tax on each worker's wages below an annual ceiling. It's called the taxable wage base. Many of you probably also know that the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. It's a simple calculation to figure out how much a minimum wage worker is paid in the course of a year. It's $14,500. That's a full-time minimum wage worker. Now, what few people seem to realize is that the earnings subject to the UI tax are usually below the annual earnings of a full-time, year-round minimum wage worker. How many states have a wage base lower than that amount? Well, 33. 2/3 of the states, employers pay exactly the same UI tax for their minimum wage workers as they do for their CEO. This chart shows states' taxable wage bases in relationship to the annual earnings of a minimum wage worker. In 3 of the states, employers pay the maximum UI tax for someone who is on a half-time work schedule and is paid the minimum wage. In another 19 states, employers pay the maximum UI tax for minimum wage workers who work between 20 and 30 hours a week on a full-time schedule, on a full year-round schedule. All of these people would be classified as part-time workers. Interestingly, in some of these same states, if part-time minimum wage workers have the misfortune to get laid off from their job and they go down to the unemployment insurance office and honestly answer the intake worker's question, what kind of a job are you looking for? And they say, I'm looking for a part-time job. They would say, well, you're not eligible for unemployment benefits. They've just paid the maximum. Their employer has paid on their behalf the maximum UI tax, and they're not eligible for UI benefits. Let's think about what this means for workers in a couple of states. Here is California, where the UI tax wage base is $7,000 a year. According to DOL, the minimum statutory UI tax in California is 1.5%. The maximum is 6.2%. This chart shows the tax employers pay on the workers who have 3 different wage levels: 1/2 the minimum wage year-round earnings, year-round minimum wage earnings, and 4 times minimum wage earnings. Now, as it happens, the California minimum wage last year was 75 cents an hour higher than the federal minimum wage, but it doesn't make any difference whether you use either the California or the federal minimum wage. A half-time minimum wage worker is a worker on whom the maximum UI tax is imposed. For an employer facing the lowest tax rate, that tax was $105 a year, and for an employer facing the maximum rate, it was $434 a year. California, it's at the bottom. What if we go look at a state right in the middle? Massachusetts, taxable wage base $14,000. That's around the middle. There, the statutory tax rate is 1.26%. At the low point for an employer facing the lowest tax, it's 12.27% for the employer facing the maximum tax. These are the taxes that are imposed on the wages of these 3 workers. Now, here you see somebody at the minimum wage who works full-time hours does indeed face a higher tax rate than someone who works at half-time hours, but someone who makes 4 times the minimum wage, the tax is exactly the same. Here's the state that has the maximum wage base. That's Washington State. Again, in this case, there is a higher tax for people paid more than the minimum wage, but you'll notice that it's not 4 times as high, and that's because the wage base is less than 4 times what a minimum wage worker earns if he is on a full-time schedule. So, some of you might think that a tax that is the same for a minimum wage worker as it is for the CEO of a company might be classified as regressive. I agree with that. More than a decade ago, Patricia Anderson and Bruce Meyer, a couple of economists in the Midwest, wrote a paper estimating the regressivity of the UI tax. Let's assume for a minute that the full burden of this tax is not paid by the employer, who actually writes the check, but is paid by the worker in the form of lower wages than otherwise would be paid. Actually, that's not easy for a minimum wage worker, but for someone paid just a little bit more than the minimum wage worker, it certainly is plausible. Turning to Anderson and Meyer's findings, in 1994, workers in the bottom 1/10 of the U.S. wage distribution paid about 2.8% of their wages for the UI tax. Workers in the top 1/10 of the wage distribution paid about 0.4% of their wages for the UI tax. The tax rate ratio is therefore 7 to 1. As a percent of wages, the bottom 1/10 of wage earners in the United States pay 7 times the UI tax imposed on the highest paid workers in the country. Now, the data in this study are now 17 years old. In many of the states, the taxable wage base hasn't increased very much in those 17 years. However, wages in the top 1/10 of the income, wage distribution have gone up a great deal. Those in the middle have gone up less, and those at the bottom have also gone up less. So a reasonable conjecture would be it's more regressive now than it was when they did their study. Compared with the UI tax, both the Social Security payroll tax and the sales tax look like models of progressive taxation, and as you probably know, they're considered regressive taxes. The Social Security payroll tax is capped when wages reach about $107,000 every year. As I recall some old CBO analysis, the Social Security tax, payroll tax, is actually a progressive tax up to family incomes of about $150,000 a year. In other words, at $150,000, family income level of $150,000, the tax rate is slightly higher as a burden, a share of their income, than it is for someone paid $100,000 and higher too than it is for households with $50,000. And that's because, of course, many families with $150,000 of income have more than one wage earner, and the Social Security tax is imposed on all those earnings. To be sure, the UI tax doesn't look so bad if you compare the tax and its distribution across the population and the benefits as they're distributed across the population. And the reason for that is that people who are low wage tend to get laid off much more, and so they're more likely to be have an insurable event. They're more likely to be unemployed and collect benefits under the system. But even so, it is still a regressive and quite regressive tax. Now, the UI tax base does not and has not recently come remotely close to keeping up with average wages, as the taxable wage cap has continuously fallen in relationship to the average wage. A larger and larger percentage of the tax is being levied on the wages of the workers who have the lowest wages. The main factor that is generating this increased regressivity is simply the very low cap on taxable wages. It has two pernicious effects. First, it causes the UI payroll tax to climb, the total revenues raised by the tax to climb more slowly than wages. This doesn't make any sense when weekly UI benefits are climbing roughly in line with wage growth. The average weekly benefit bears about the same relationship to the average weekly wage today as it did 15 years ago or 30 years ago. So benefits are keeping up with wages. What isn't keeping up is the taxable wage base. In the long run, the effect is to starve the system of revenues unless state legislatures increase the tax rate that they impose on this very narrow tax base, which of course is one thing that they've been doing. But in the first instance, the effect of the low cap is to push state UI systems toward very low trust fund balances, which I think is bad for insurance because they enter a recession and they have less reserves than they ought to have to cover the expected burden of paying for benefits during severe recessions. Second, by maintaining low taxable caps, state UI systems tend to boost the tax rate applied to the low earnings amounts that are subject to this tax. The UI tax then becomes the equivalent of a poll tax on new employment or on a new person put on the payrolls. Any job created in a year, except jobs with very low wages that are at the very end of the year, are going to cause the employers to pay the maximum UI tax for that job. Simple economic theory suggests the incentive created by a high tax rate imposed on a very small taxable wage base is to discourage job creation while encouraging employers to add to the work hours of their existing workforce. In states with a very low tax base, the UA tax becomes a penalty on job creation, on adding to your payrolls, at least in the short and intermediate runs. In sum, the tax is regressive. It's growing more regressive each passing year. This regressivity seems unfair in and of itself. Whatever adverse incentives it may be creating. And second, the regressivity is caused by the very low and the very slowly rising tax cap. And this causes two problems for the system. Just in case you haven't gotten the point yet, it slows the growth of tax revenue, and it hurts UI trust fund balances. And finally, it pushes state legislatures to impose higher taxes on the narrow tax base that is subject to this tax. And this has very undesirable incentive effects in addition to the undesirable equity aspect of it. My suggestion is very simple. It's an easy takeaway. The federal government ought to raise its own UI taxable wage base to 1/2 the Social Security wage base, bringing it to $53,000, and it should raise the wage base every year at the same rate that it increases the Social Security wage base. Moreover, it should require every state to follow course and have a wage base that is no less than the federal UI wage base. Believe it or not, the wage bases of the Social Security and the UI systems were once identical to one another. If we had the same system that we had in the past, the wage base for the UI system would be $106,800. Now, if my policy proposal is followed, of course, I think that the UI tax rate on wages should be greatly lowered. It should be a very small fraction of what it currently is, because you have a much bigger tax base on which you're applying this tax. State UI taxable wage ceilings should then be reset to match the federal wage base, or to be higher if states choose to do so. But I do think that this is it's a little-known aspect of the system, but it's foolish both from the point of view of raising revenues and from the point of view of equitably distributing the burden of this particular program across the workforce. Thank you.
Thanks. Now, is someone else going to put my presentation up, or should I try to navigate the laptop? Let's see. It's a great pleasure to be here. NASI serves a very important function, and especially at this moment, I think it's important. It's an important function because the labor market in the U.S. is one of the worst. That was certainly the worst that I've ever seen in my lifetime, and there's a serious risk, I think, that what might be viewed as a fluctuation could turn into a structural problem if we get policy wrong at this moment. I am going to talk today in my 15 minutes about some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years, both originally on my own and lately jointly with Dean Baker. We're kind of unlikely bedfellows in this, and we've wandered into this topic from completely different angles. For me, I was at something that I'm not sure Dean does very often. I was at a friend's wedding who's a hedge fund guy, and I don't know how many friends Dean has who manage hedge funds. But he came up to me at his wedding and said, "Kevin, you used to live in Germany." It's an old friend. He remembers that I grew up. I spent some time there. Look into why the German unemployment situation is so good. I don't understand it. German GDP has been tanking. They're in worse shape than we are, and yet the unemployment rate has barely budged at all. And so I dusted off my German and called some old friends in Berlin and noodled around and found that the Germans have a program that is called Kurzarbeit, which basically we translated into work sharing. And I started studying the literature on work sharing and then the functions of work sharing in Germany, and have convinced myself that we've really messed up by not expanding a work sharing German-like system in the U.S., that we've caused a lot of harm that we could have ameliorated had we been more aggressive about learning the lessons of work sharing. I could say that we're pretty late to the game. I'm about to give you some slides that help you understand why I get almost emotional about it when I think about the lost opportunity. All of the EU 27 now have pretty aggressive work sharing programs. In the U.S., some states have them, but nothing like what's going on over there. Now, the idea of work sharing is a slightly different form of unemployment insurance, but I like to think of it as fractional unemployment insurance. And so the idea is that right now, suppose that you're a firm and you spent lots of money over the last decade putting together a workforce. People, you spent a lot of search costs acquiring them, but now your sales are really down, and your costs are high, and you have to think about how am I going to reduce costs. But you love these people, and you'd like to keep them around because you know that if you start recovering again, then you're going to have to have search costs again if they're not sitting in the plant. Basically, to get the government to help you along, then in this, if you think of it as basically almost like a big family business where you care about everybody equally and you care about their utility, well then the only way to get the government to sort of help you with your problem is to separate a person, or the best way is to separate a person completely from their job. And the idea of work sharing is really just that why not let a person reduce somebody's hours, maybe 10%. 10% tends to be the minimum in European design, and then let them get 10% of their unemployment insurance. Now there's a 1990s literature that Axel Borsch-Schuppan did a nice review of that looked at whether work-sharing-like programs can have a permanent effect on the unemployment rate. And I think that there are a lot of reasons to understand, to believe the result, that it's not a very good long-run labor policy. That it's not likely. It's sort of like the French shorter work week, but that in a crisis like the one that we just experienced, then there are a lot of reasons to think that this policy might actually be superior, because instead of laying off one person, you could reduce hours 20% for 5 people. And then even if some of those people are kind of worried that it might get worse for them down the road, if they're out searching and they're searching from a position, they're not separated from the labor force the way that one person would be. And so there are 5 people who are better connected to the workplace than that one person that you would have to cut loose. And then once things turn around, since these people might be hanging around, then it'll actually be quicker and easier for you to ramp production back up to where you wanted it to be all along, because the people are hanging around. Now, you don't, in Germany, and I think this is a sound design, a sound practice, they don't replace 100% of the lost wages. They replace about 2/3 of the lost wages, and so there is some cost for everybody about this. Now, there's very little access to this thing, to programs like this, the 18 states that have them in the U.S., but the take-up rate in Germany actually was astonishing in the sense that 64,000 establishments, I'll show you a map in a minute, in 2009, with 1.5 million employees out of about a 40 million workforce, were on work sharing in 2009. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that since work sharing is not necessarily replacing 100% of a person's wage, or the fraction of it that the unemployment insurance would apply to, then it can actually be not so expensive. Because I guess there's sort of an interesting question of what the right counterfactual is. But if the counterfactual is that the person would be laid off and they'd lose 100% of their salary, or they'd have some smaller fraction of their salary reduced and stay around, or a couple of them, then it might not cost so much. But the program in Germany in 2009 has an identifiable budget cost of only about 5 billion euros for 2009. If we prorate the program to the U.S., to say it worked just the same in the U.S., then it would cost us about $20 billion a year, which is a pretty small fraction of what we spent on stimulus. If we think that the work-sharing program could be layered onto a UI benefit program like the one that we already have, then to the extent that we have reduced UI benefits because people are on work-sharing, then that would make those costs lower. So if we did spend that $20 billion, what would we get? Well, first let's look at the thing that made my friend come over to me at his wedding, when he should have been thinking about other things, I suppose. So if you look at the change in real GDP through 2009, you can see that Europe and Germany actually they fared much worse than the U.S. But if you look at the German and the U.S. unemployment rates over that time, you see a really striking difference. And so there's been a lot of work trying to figure out whether we can attribute this difference specifically to the work-sharing program. And there's some evidence that, again, if you just think about the large number of people that were affected, there's some evidence both in the regional level. This chart sort of shows you where it was happening. It's very densely situated in the sort of exporting manufacturing sector. If you think about it, Germany is an export-intensive economy, and world trade kind of stopped in 2009 for a moment. It was just a radical drop-off, and so they had very serious near-term issues, and basically the pockets of export manufacturing in particular are places where there's very, very heavy reliance on work-sharing. The work-sharing also skyrocketed right in that pocket. Where trade was collapsing. That's what this chart shows. It's the number of establishments with work sharing and the number of participants with work sharing. The interesting thing is that it also seems to have worked in the sense that it didn't create a permanent entitlement where maybe there's a scam that firms would necessarily be playing where they keep people on part-time work and let the government share the cost of the workers, that as soon as the economy started to turn around and exports started to go back up, then there was a reduction, already a kind of turning on the dime of the program. Interesting thing too is that economics would teach us that you would hoard the workers and use work sharing that are kind of hard to find, that are skilled, that have a lot of on-the-job training. If you look at who it was that was affected by work sharing, it's an interesting group of folks. It's engineers, metal production workers, folks who operate machine tools and electrical equipment. So these are the people that have potentially highly cyclical employment in the manufacturing sector, but have a lot of value to the firm that is acquired by learning by doing. And so it'd be very costly for firms to replace them down the road. This suggests that there's a serious economic efficiency for keeping these people around in the firms. And I think that we're seeing that now as we're starting to see that the recovery in Germany, I think, is now kind of running ahead of us. It could be in part because these people are already sitting where they need to be. So given this episode, then the question is, so what if we had just had in the start of July '08 that we had adopted German work sharing and that it was popular enough so that everybody in the U.S. used it at about the same rate as the Germans. And so I'm just taking the German experience and saying, let's just suppose that happened in the U.S. The red line, and this is a computer simulation that we did, they're using some results from a couple of European papers that came out late last year. The red line is the U.S. Unemployment rate, and the blue line is what the U.S. unemployment rate would have done if we had the same take-up rate for work sharing and every single person who had a reduction in their hours would have otherwise been unemployed. So the blue line is kind of unattainable. That's not, because the whole point of work sharing is we're spreading it out. The shaded region is the opportunity set. That's where we would have ended up, somewhere in that shaded region. I think that the question of whether, sometimes people get put on work sharing who otherwise they would have kept around. Maybe sometimes people are put on work sharing because they do that instead of laying them off. That's a very open question, exactly where in that space we would be, and that's why I left it wide. I didn't want to give you my best estimate, but I'll tell you my best estimate, which is that about the average reduction in hours for the 1.5 million people out of the 40 million labor force in 2009 that were on this was 30%, which is a pretty big reduction in hours. And that means that probably, if we had the same experience in the U.S., we'd be about 2/3 of the way up in the shaded region. which still means that the unemployment rate right now would be a smidge above 8% instead of what we've got. And so for me, I think that there are two residual questions. One is it too late? And the other is it politically feasible? And I'll finish with those two questions. Is it too late? I don't have a slide prepared on that, but everybody in this audience in particular knows these data better than I do. That the gross flows in the U.S. labor market are really, really high. Right now, we're looking at something like 6 million a month. The idea of work sharing is that you slow down the outflow by having firms hoard people a little bit, making it easy for them to hoard. And since the net job number that you see in the employment report is really a net of job creation and destruction. If we could slow destruction that's happening at, say, 6 million a month by 10% or so, then imagine that the net job number would be way, way higher. And I don't know if you could get 10% out of a work-sharing program, but my view is that it definitely works when it's pursued aggressively, and it can slow job destruction. We know that by looking at the German experience, and if we slow job destruction right now, that gives job creation a kind of head start in giving us big monthly net numbers. In terms of political feasibility, I don't know. I don't know. I think that it's been very disappointing, the experience that I've had with this. I guess someone like Gary, who's been, as we mentioned, testifying at Ways and Means on these issues for a long time, maybe you certainly know this policy terrain better than I do, where I'm usually testifying at Ways and Means like last week on tax policy. But I'll talk to politicians and say, geez, why aren't we doing this? And just about everybody says, you're right, we should do it, but then it doesn't happen. And I would encourage you to see the sort of drama that this presentation can create in Congress, to go back and look at a hearing at the House Financial Services Committee last year, where I was testifying on the state of the economy and then asked to give some prescriptions about what to do. And I presented work sharing. As an alternative right now, a cost-effective alternative. And I really encourage you to go back and look at the transcript at what people said. And then think about how it could be that given that almost euphoria in the committee over the idea that this is something we ought to try with the unemployment rate so high, the fact that nothing has happened. My own guess is that as we transition out of really, really long UI benefits and towards a new system, it would be a natural time to try to get work sharing in there too. And in the typical European design, it's not there all the time. It kicks in big time in a recession. And so instead of being in a world where in a recession all of a sudden UI benefits last forever or for a really, really long time, they have a system where all of a sudden it's a recession, so we need to get more aggressive about allowing work sharing and funding work sharing. So that suggests that that's been politically feasible. Now granted, politics in Europe is a lot different, and maybe here we should try to move towards a system ahead of the next cycle that's like that. And so thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so now for something completely different. As I hope won't become too painfully obvious, I know nothing about unemployment insurance, at least very, very little about unemployment insurance. I'm thankful to my fellow panelists, Gary and Kevin, in particular, for actually doing what the panel is supposed to do and offer some possible solutions, because that's not really what I did either. What I'm mean to do is to ask, is there a problem with respect to social equity and especially racial equity, and begin to poke around at some of the possible reasons why it may exist to the degree that it does exist. I do have a few things to say about what we might do if the findings I have bear up after more work is done. I also want to thank Angela Glover Blackwell for really offering a nice, very important backdrop in terms of context and stakes for this conversation. I'm concerned with racial equity, right? And certainly my work and the Kirwan Institute's work is all about the implication of race in social vulnerability and in access to opportunities. So that's how I come to this question of what is unemployment insurance doing? So we start with the observation that the latest recession has been especially bad, unemployment has been especially bad for blacks and Latinos. Right? As late as October, and I think it's roughly the same now still, for African Americans about 16%, for Latinos about 13%, right? Well above the average for the country as a whole. It's also true that blacks and Latinos are greatly overrepresented among the long-term unemployed. For African Americans in particular, you see that their long-term unemployment rate is about 22%, or double their labor force percentage, right? So that's pretty astoundingly big and problematic. Moreover, that has been true for a while, at least over the last several recessions. Again, that African American portion of the labor force, about 10–11% in each of the last 4 recessions, and at least twice or more than twice that in terms of long-term unemployment. So this is not a new problem. The problem, of course, is that they seem to be, African Americans and Latinos both, seem to be somewhat underrepresented among recipients of unemployment insurance. The problem in really making that claim stick or assessing that claim empirically as well as we'd like is that states are essentially allowed to do whatever they want to do in terms of collecting race ethnicity data on the folks who apply for unemployment insurance. So, there's a lot of unreported data from the states. Most states, in fact, have lots of noise in race ethnic identity of the folks who are getting unemployment insurance or even applying for it. So what I've done is look at 15 states where the data is pretty good. And I can talk about exactly what pretty good means. But essentially it means, on average 95% or better reporting on race data and 95% or better reporting on Hispanic, non-Hispanic data, right, the ethnicity data. And what you see when you do that across those 15 states is that the overall recipiency rate for that group of people in those states, for unemployed workers in those states, is 41%. For whites, it's about 2 points higher. For African Americans, about 2 points lower, and for Latinos, much lower. And sorry, I'm a little bit sick. And there's lots of variation at the state level. So these are the 7 most populous states among those 15, just to drive home the point that in different states, there's some different things going on. With Latinos, though, pretty regularly being least represented, apparently, although even here in Illinois, you see they seem to have the highest recipiency rates among the unemployed. Why is this an issue? I would argue it's an issue, looking at this at a race lens, through a race lens, is important not simply because, or let me put it differently, the equity issue isn't only about, right, which groups are getting what amount of unemployment insurance, what kind of coverage rates we see across race ethnicity. It's about, as well, who's most vulnerable. And again, Angela mentioned this during her talk, and in fact used some of the same information. But the story is looking across, married and cohabiting households, single men and single women. The basic pattern is white, non-Hispanic. The whites and non-Hispanics in those groups do much, much, much better in terms of their wealth holdings, right, which translates into an ability to weather the unemployment storm, if it should come. And that black and Hispanics not only do poorly, but one does better than the other depending on group, depending on particular category we're looking at. And that at the sort of low end, if you will, single black women, if you exclude the value of their vehicles, $100, right, is the median household income. $100 for Hispanic women, single women, $120 if you exclude the value of their vehicles. So this is an exceedingly vulnerable population. Tom Shapiro at Brandeis, who's done a lot of wealth work and race and wealth work, looked particularly at African American families and found that even high-income African Americans have very, very, very little wealth, especially if you exclude household or house equity, right, equity on their homes. So they're not in much better shape than low-income African Americans, and in fact are in worse shape than middle-income whites. So it's a serious, serious problem for Black and Latino families. Now, why is this? There are at least 5, I'm sure there are in fact more explanations, but here are 5 I just want to acknowledge, 3 of which I'm going to take a quick look at. So one is that, all right, Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately likely to live in low coverage states. So it's a bad luck, right, sort of geographic distribution issue. Now, no, not to say that race isn't implicated in that as well, but on its face, right, it's not a racial issue, it's a geographic distribution issue. The second possibility, and none of these, it's mutually exclusive, of course. Beyond the geographic distribution possibility, it may be that within states, Blacks and Latinos have enjoy a different worker status, right? Part-time, full-time, low wage or not, that impacts on affects their eligibility to receive unemployment insurance. A third possibility is that race is more directly implicated in the discrepancy, the disparities we see. A fourth that I'm not going to look at now is that unemployed Blacks and Latinos are less likely to apply for unemployment insurance to begin with. I'd love to hear ideas about work that's been done that allows us to take a closer look at that in any way. And then one, too, I wanted to mention, and this is just supposition on my part, that since much of the comparison, or since the entire comparison that I'm making is of the unemployed to those who receive benefits, that it seems likely to me that undocumented immigrants are more likely to be weighed on the unemployment side, because I'm not aware that in gathering that information, there's anything, they ask any questions that would allow for the identification of undocumented immigrants. So they're more likely to be weighed in on the unemployment side than on the UI receipt side, right? So that would explain as well for, especially for Latinos, of whom immigrants in general comprise a larger portion. So on the first point, are they unfavorably distributed with respect to coverage rates, right? Are they unfavorably distributed in low coverage states? And the answer seems to be yes. So what I did here is take the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, divide them into 3 groups of 17 according to recipiency rates, and see where the population, right, white, Black, Latino populations, how those are distributed across those 3 categories by recipiency rates. And what you see is, let's start with the white population, about 1/3 in each category. If you take 5 or 6% from the high end in the white distribution and push it into the middle, you get the African American distribution. And then if you take 17% from the African American distribution in the middle and push it down toward the low end, you get the Latino distribution. So, clearly, judging from this, it is the case that geographic distribution has something to do with it, with the effect being greatest by far for the Latino population. Are they overrepresented among the folks who are most likely to be ineligible? Again, just looking at a couple things, I think there's something to this. So the 2 things I looked at just to get a quick, again, taste for what's happening here. Job losers as opposed to re-entrants, as opposed to new entrants to the labor force being the ones who are most likely to qualify for unemployment and in fact most likely to seek it out. That Blacks, about 58% of the unemployed among African Americans were job losers versus 64% of whites. It's also true if you look at low income that African Americans and Hispanics as well overrepresented among low wage workers. Right, in this case I looked at minimum wage. So it seems that there's something to this explanation as well. But really the thing I'm most interested in, I don't think either of those things, I doubt either of those is very surprising to folks who are more familiar than I am with how UI works. But I was especially interested in this third issue of whether or not there's a more sort of direct racial sort of insinuation. And in particular, I'm interested in the role of discretion, right, in administering the system. So let's assume, let's look at the universe of folks who decide to apply for unemployment insurance, and then let's look at the particular decision-making points in their process of trying to get it, and at the role of discretion, right? Individuals making discretionary judgments about whether or not this claimant, in fact, is entitled, and how much he or she is entitled to, and so on. And to the degree that that does play a role, and that other sorts of directly racialized phenomena play a role, these are some of the things I think you might expect to find, right? So, for example, positive association between recipiency rates and the proportion, not the number, but the proportion of African Americans and Latinos in states. And I'll say a bit more about some of these as I go along. But why am I, it might be tempting to think, well, it's pretty cynical, right? Pretty cynical to sort of go looking for discrimination. And I think, no, I think I'm not cynical at all. I think actually that it might be close to naive to suppose that it doesn't exist in light of what we know, and not anecdotally, but in light of the research that's been done about how discrimination, not least of all, discrimination fed by implicit bias, hidden biases, work in other arenas where much more work has been done, right? So by implicit bias, I mean sort of cognitive biases that are not explicit. There are these explicit conscious attitudes that we have, and most of us, let's say in this room, let's say all of us in this room, explicitly will say, we're very egalitarian across race, ethnicity, gender, etc. We believe in fairness and justice. We agree with, much of what Angela Glover Blackwell had to say in that respect. But then there are these hidden biases, right, that we may not be aware of, that don't have much to do with how we feel explicitly about things, but nevertheless may have behavioral implications. And in fact, we know that this is true. So here are the results of an implicit association test, which essentially tests for the presence of implicit biases. It's been done hundreds of thousands of times by internet and in other settings as well that are more controlled. But these are some internet results for black-white, essentially trying to gauge the subject's preference, implicit preference for blacks versus whites. And what you see is that if you add up the strong preference for whites to moderate to slight, you get 70%, against 12% of subjects showing a preference from slight to strong for African Americans, right? And that's pretty typical, and we see that not only across in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of weight, for example, right? We tend to be biased against people who are overweight. We tend to be biased against older people in this country, very much a cultural thing. We tend to be biased against darker-skinned people, even within race, than against the lighter-skinned people within a race, and so on. And again, behavioral implications. So I won't go through all of this, but here are just 5 examples that have been shown to be true. So just the first one, the shooter game, is, so you imagine a situation of a police officer, right, who confronts, is on the lookout for a suspect and sees, a young white man versus a young black man, and that this young man has something in his hand, and the question is that a gun, or is it a wallet, is it a cell phone, is it something else, is it innocuous or not? And what we find is that when people are tested in this way, they tend to shoot more unarmed blacks and fail to shoot armed whites. But across the board in other arenas, we find that this is a significant implicit bias ties significantly into behavioral choices, discretionary choices. So that's why I'm concerned, right? That's why I look for it. Little scatter plot, states with higher proportions of African Americans indeed tend to have a lower unemployment insurance coverage rates. And that correlation is significant. The same is true with respect to Latinos and coverage rates, although the relationship is weaker. For whites, the relationship goes the other way. I mean, I hope you'll take a moment to sort of think about that, right? The higher the proportion of blacks in the state, the more likely the lower the recipiency rate in the state. Again, distinct from the numbers of blacks in the state, right? I'm not even gonna say anything about that. And then this last one, another thing that I would expect to be true if, in fact, there's this discretionary bias in play in the way the program is administered, in terms of the outcomes that people get as they progress through the program, is that you would expect there to be more improper, some more errors that go against blacks and Latinos as a result of discretionary judgments that are being made, right? So you need to have more corrections made to overturn judgments against black and Latino claimants. So I looked at 3 kinds of errors that are tracked by the Denied Claims Accuracy Report out of the Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration program. Found nothing meaningful in 2 of them, but this positive and significant correlation in terms of monetary denial rates for blacks and Latinos. So in other words, in states that have large proportions of blacks and Latinos, you see more mistakes being made that are that disadvantage blacks and Latinos. So what do you do about it? I have another slide which is full of all sorts of genius recommendations. I'm kidding. There are no genius recommendations on that slide. There are a few others, but I just want to mention these 4 that speak specifically to racial ethnic bias, right? So one is to make the data available. I mean, make it mandatory, it's collection mandatory for race ethnicity, or else we can't know in a serious way. I had to rely on 15 states, and even those are missing some data. So let's collect the data. Second, let's conduct audit tests for bias. Rich was telling me before we started that the Department of Labor Civil Rights Center, in fact, has plans to do exactly that, so I'm delighted to hear it. Audit tests have revealed a great deal in other arenas, certainly housing for a long time, employment, and so on. Second or third, reduce bureaucratic discretion through still greater use of automation. I know that increasingly, Rich also tells me, gave me a nice education before we started, that there aren't many people doing sort of processing, filing their claims in person anymore. That happens much, much more by internet now, and to some degree by telephone. That's a good thing. I would say my guess is that you're likely to see greater bias with the phone claims than with the internet claims. And then finally, to the degree that we find that there is some bias that gets played out in the processing, offer debiasing training. And I'm done. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the panel very much for their presentations. It's one of those rare panels where the panelists actually took the title of the panel seriously and followed it very closely, so we greatly appreciate that. And just, I know I'm substitute moderator, but I'm going to take the liberty of being substitute commentator for the moment also. So I'm going to take that role just briefly, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Going back to Gary's presentation, again, this is unemployment insurance and promising solutions to systemic problems. And each panelist identified a problem and had a solution to that systemic problem. In the case of Gary Burtless, it's a regressive federal taxable wage base and also regressive state taxable wage bases and the attendant problems that result from those. And I think Gary could have gone a little bit farther, and I guess I'll ask you a quick question after I finish the summary here. Maybe I'll lead off with the question, but let me just pose it to you now and you can think about it. But I remember in the 1990s there was an advisory council on unemployment compensation. And one of the arguments that that council made was that in unemployment insurance, there was a kind of race to the bottom. As you pointed out, taxes tend to grow at a slightly slower rate than benefits for various reasons. And then that puts pressure on states in recessions. They often have to borrow from the federal government to pay benefits, and then they have to correct the imbalance in their system after a recession. And they often do that by not only raising taxes, but also looking at the benefit side and reaching a compromise and cutting benefits too. And I'm just curious, Gary, whether you've seen a decline in the relative size of the unemployment insurance system. But let me get back to that one in a moment. And then the systemic problem that Kevin identified, of course, is relatively high unemployment rates in the United States compared to Germany. And he discussed the pervasiveness now of Kurzarbeit in not only Deutschland, but also Europe. And we don't have that in the United States. We have short-time compensation in about 18 states or so. It might be 19, depending on how you count. And it hasn't spread, even though everybody has been discussing it and talking favorably about it for about the last 3 years or so. So it is a little surprising that states aren't taking up that good possibility, which could lead to more efficient labor markets and more equitable distribution of unemployment. And then finally, Andrew spoke of what might be called systemic discrimination in the system, which can exist in the labor market too, and unemployment insurance to some extent is reflective of systemic discrimination that might exist in the labor market. But also that kind of discrimination can occur in the unemployment insurance area. There are two types of eligibility in unemployment insurance. One is monetary eligibility, where states simply look at your work history, your wages, how much you've been employed, and then they determine a weekly benefit amount and potential duration for you. But there are also so-called non-monetary decisions, where judgments have to be made about separation issues, for example. Why did you lose your job? Were you fired for good cause, for example? Or did you quit? Or were you laid off simply because of lack of work? And there, as Andrew pointed out, that's potentially a problem. He presents some data suggesting that it might be, and more work needs to be done in that area. And as he pointed out, indeed, the Civil Rights Center at the U.S. Department of Labor has started some work in that area, and I want to introduce Andrew to some individuals who work there, and hopefully he can find out what they're doing, and perhaps they can collaborate a little. So, Gary, I would like to ask the first question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. We have two microphones on the left and right, and we also have a hand-held microphone for anyone who can't come to one of those microphones. So, Gary, the question.
The unemployment insurance system has shrunk if you measure its size in relation to the amount of compensation received by American workers. It should be obvious why that has happened. It only replaces lost wages. It doesn't replace the fringe benefits that you lose when you lose your job, and fringe benefits are now an more important part of compensation. The cost of providing health insurance to your workers, the cost of funding a pension plan for your workers is now more of compensation. But unemployment insurance program has also shrunk in relationship to wages, the total wages paid in the United States. And the simplest explanation in my looking at the data is that a smaller share of newly laid off workers are collecting benefits today compared with the share that collected benefits from, say, 1950 to 1980. There's been a decline in the percentage of newly laid off workers that are collecting benefits, and I think that explains why that is the main explanation. It looks to me as though the average benefit paid per week to a worker still bears the same relationship to the average wage paid to American workers as it did, so that it's smaller because fewer of the unemployed are collecting benefits, not because the benefit per se has been reduced.
Okay, thank you, Gary. We'll start on my right.
Hi, Tom Rankin, California Alliance for Retired Americans. I used to be with the state AFL-CIO. I would spend a lot of time in California working on unemployment insurance issues. And the problem we had, and I really like Gary's proposal, is that We were successful, for instance, last time we got a benefit increase was in 2001. I remember because it was negotiated on 9/11. And it was a significant increase phased in over a number of years, but the employers refused then and refused every year since then to increase the taxable wage base. We need a 2/3 vote to do things, increase either the tax rate or the taxable wage base in California. So the only way it's going to happen in the foreseeable future is if the federal government takes action on this. And I wondered if what you think, as Kevin asked, is it politically feasible? And I wondered, I know that, I'm sorry that NELP's not here because I think they were working on this issue. Is there some way of tying this new requirement for a higher taxable wage base to a forgiveness of some of the loans that the states owe to the federal government? California, for instance, I think by the end of this year is going to owe $13 billion that they borrowed to pay the UI benefits. The state itself is on the hook for $360 million in interest payments, which they are trying to borrow from the state disability insurance program, which is paid for by workers and works the way Gary says UI should work, because when the wages increase, the tax base increases for SDI benefits. So the big question is there any political possibility of this happening given the current climate in Washington? The other, I guess, factor might be that most of the states are in this bind except for states like Washington, which have a nice high wage base and have a solvent fund. But most of the states, including all those with Republican governors, would benefit from some kind of forgiveness plan.
I am an economist, not a political strategist or a political scientist. I don't know what kind of coalitions can form to make a more rational taxable wage base possible. Personally, I don't understand, except reporters from state capitals who call and ask me about this often say that the employer community in the state that they're calling from, like Austin or Missouri or wherever, the employer community is under the impression that if the tax base is bigger, it's going to be easier for more funds to flow into the unemployment insurance trust fund for the state, and therefore the state legislature will be tempted to raise benefits more than it otherwise would. So the employer community likes small reserves. They think that's a good thing because it discourages state legislatures from doing things that they think would be really awful. But objectively speaking, from the point of view of employer community, I don't know why they think that they pay any more or any less tax in the short run if you have a large tax base and a low tax rate. And as far as I know, this is not an issue that divides liberal and conservative economists. They think across the board it's better to have a big base and a low rate, but for some reason, in this particular instance, the employer community doesn't feel that way. Let me make one observation too about your comment. A little recognized effect of the decline in the size of unionization in the United States and in its importance is in state capitals. It used to be, I think, the labor leaders that were the ones negotiating in behalf of workers on something like unemployment insurance. You know, they would be there, they're in the rooms, and they're represented and they're exercising that influence. With the decline in the influence of unions, actually there tends to be only one group in the room, and that is the employer community, and the employer community has a very large say, which is one reason we have this very peculiar system of very, very low wage bases.
And as I was mentioning to Andrew at lunch, also the employer community has outsourced their representation in the process now too, so they actually have what are called third-party administrators representing them in these hearings. So they're in a very powerful position when it comes to questioning an unemployment insurance claim in hearings. On the left.
Hi, my name is Ben Vecti from NASI, and I have some questions for Kevin. I wanted to ask more about sort of causal analysis of the effect of Kurzarbeit or work sharing on on unemployment rates. I mean, it seems obvious that, as you said, that it's completely speculative. You never know for sure whether a company would have laid these people off or not. And some of my German colleagues and friends have said that one of the reasons for the decline in the unemployment rate in Germany, or actually a primary reason, is that there's been a wave of retirement in the last few years. So it may be retirements as much as work sharing that has led to the decline in the unemployment rate. So given that, first of all, have you seen any data on that, a causal analysis of those comparative factors? And then in the U.S., do we have any data on, or is it just speculative, the extent to which short-time compensation has led to declines in the unemployment rates in the states that use it vis-a-vis other states?
Yeah, the second one, there's just it's not big enough. It's the monthly fluctuations are bigger than the size of the program. In Germany, again, it sort of depends a little bit on the distribution of the hour reduction for people, but I think that you can get a % on the German unemployment rate out of work sharing if you're aggressive, and 0.5% if you're cautious, and that's yeah, I think 1% is about right, and so that's sort of how we get down into the 8s if we map it to the U.S.
Okay, question on the right.
Walter Mankoff, long retired from the Ladies Garment Workers Union, and one-time member and chair of the New York State Advisory Council on Unemployment Insurance. I want to thank the panelists because I think they did a superb job today. I've been arguing for change in tax base for 60 years. 60 years ago I was arguing for it, and labor movement has argued for it all these years, and we still don't have it realistically. So far as work sharing goes, it's been tried. It does work somewhat. The problem, again, is that it was based largely on a manufacturing economy where there was a modest reduction in production in a plant, and you could do work sharing. It's very little use if your plant is out of business, either due to recession or imports. So it has its uses, but are limited, and of course, everybody wants to eliminate discrimination in anything, including unemployment insurance. But I would point out one thing. You mentioned you prefer automated responses to eliminate subjectivity by people. The biggest problem, I think one of the big problems today, is that everybody is registering by phone, and nobody is giving them the personal attention they really need to make sure they're getting proper guidance, and that they are looking for work, and that they are ready to go to work. And more automation, I think, is not helpful. Although it may take care of the discrimination problem, it won't take care of the unemployment problem. I do want to raise one question for the panel, and that is, we're dealing here with a 70-year-old system, basically, that developed in the late 30s, at a time when it was designed for manufacturing with short-term unemployment periods, and you paid the people for a few weeks. They went back to work when the model season was over or the season was over. We're in a completely different world today, and all three panelists were essentially tweaking this antique system. I think we need to take a complete look at a completely different system, one with much more federal control. We no longer have the state divisions that we had originally, where manufacturing was done only in a little local area. And I'm just urging, maybe the panelists have some comment, but I think we have to take a very different look at unemployment insurance today and not just tweak. Even though all the remarks were urgent and useful, I think we need to look at it with a different perspective. Thank you.
Any comment, Pam?
It's certainly true that temporary layoff unemployment was much more common in the past, but be careful. I think even at the peak, it only comprised about 35% of unemployment. Two-thirds, almost two-thirds of layoffs, even in the old days, were permanent layoffs. So, and you're absolutely right, the system always worked much, much better for temporary layoff unemployment. And one reason is the employer had a very strong incentive to send every worker down to the unemployment office. In fact, the unemployment office frequently came to the plant doing the mass layoffs. And so it certainly worked much better for that. But the system has always, the majority of the customers have always been permanent layoff unemployed. And so we've gone from maybe 35% at the peak being temporary layoff unemployment down to under 20% now, but it's not as though the system, even at the very inception, wasn't dealing with people who've been permanently laid off.
Your comment brought to mind something I whispered to Gary when I was sort of rudely doing that a little while ago, but it was a response to what Andrew was saying, and I'm not an expert on UI, as you know, the current system, and the question was that there's this, in the public finance literature, there's been a lot of behavioral stuff on 401ks and auto-enrollment, and I just wondered if there wasn't some opportunity for auto-enrollment in the UI space to sort of address Andrew's problem, and whether people have studied that. And so maybe it's a question for Gary. I mean, is it possible? So why not just?
Well, of course, a lot of employers like to contest the claims that their permanently laid off workers file. They just, some employers just routinely challenge everyone and let the worker then work through the appeal system saying, no, I wasn't discharged for cause, I was just discharged because there was too little work. But I think that is a cynical thing to do, and I don't think it's done very often. Rich knows more than I do.
I would just add, before we go to the next question on the left, that the U.S. Department of Labor and this administration is re-emphasizing reemployment services to unemployment insurance. And if you look at the research evidence, it is highly cost-effective. And for some reason, in Washington, we're just getting around to recognizing evidence that's been accumulated over the last 20 years that reemployment services are highly cost-effective. So we hope to make some progress in that area. Question on the left. Pam.
Hi, I'm Pamela Larson from the National Academy. This is a question for Kevin, inspired by Andrew. I've heard a lot about the distinction made in Germany about Turkish citizens and Eastern Europeans that work there and all, and whether it's discrimination or not, I don't know. But do you know if the data that you used represents the entire German labor force or just the German-born labor force?
No, it's the German, it's the legal German labor force. But you know, the sort of allusion to the Turks in Germany is actually, I think it's better than when I lived there in terms of the discrimination. Perhaps the same kind of progress, halting progress we've made. But one thing about work sharing that I noticed from the gross flows literature, talking to my colleague at AEI and University of Chicago, Steve Davis, is that there appears to be kind of a mismatch. When you're looking for discrimination, that when the job's created in the U.S., it seems like the minority share, the minority chance of getting that job is about what you would expect. But when a job's destroyed, then there's a disproportionate chance that it's the minority that loses its job. That's where you see it in the gross flows. And that's a reason why my expectation would be, if we looked at Turks, but certainly in the U.S., would be that if we went to a work-sharing program, it would disproportionately benefit the people that Andrew just showed us were disproportionately harmed in this recession, because you would be slowing the destruction that tends to target them.
Question?
Alexander Hurdle-Fernandez. I'm a grad student at Harvard University. I first really want to quickly to offer a thought from the political science literature on the political feasibility of implementing work sharing in the United States. So there's a body of research in political science that suggests that firms were really important to creating the work sharing institutions in Germany and in other countries. And it wasn't just any firms, it was firms with workers that had highly specific skills to that firm or that industry that weren't easily portable to other firms or other industries. And that research suggests that since in the United States we tend to have a more general skill profile of our workers, that there isn't a really good match for those institutions. So if you wanted to build a political coalition in the States, you would have to really focus on those firms that had workers that couldn't transfer those skills. My question was directed to the whole panel, and I wanted to ask about young adults that are leaving the labor force. You know, the young adult population has been disproportionately hit by the recession, and they're leaving the labor force in droves. Are there lessons that we can learn from Germany and other countries as to how to keep young adults attached to the labor force, perhaps through the unemployment insurance system, tying it more closely to training and workforce development?
Well, Germany is like the United States in requiring people to have previous experience, and I think in Germany it's about the same amount of experience you need in order to be insured under unemployment insurance. So that unlike some other European countries where unemployment benefits or something like unemployment benefits are made available to people who are not, have not had previous attachment to the workforce, in Germany it's like here, you know, you've got to have worked basically a year and be discharged for, you know, nothing that has to do with your own behavior in order to collect an unemployment check. Germany used to be unusually successful, even compared with the United States, but especially compared with other European countries, in getting young people employed because of a system in which their schooling system was closely integrated into their employment system. People, especially in manual trades, started schooling, or when they were completing their schooling, they were spending half the time at a workplace, and they had recognized credentials by the time they completed those programs at age 19 or 20. And the result was that, in fact, their young people had lower unemployment rates than did the prime age population, unlike the United States and unlike the rest of Europe. That system is somewhat breaking down because young Germans want to have college diplomas, and it is getting harder, apparently, to recruit employers to participate in that system that called the dual system. It still is an important part of the German labor market, but it is not as important as I understand it as it used to be. And I don't know whether unemployment insurance, whether there's any difference in the unemployment insurance systems between the U.S. and Germany that would account for the lower unemployment rates typically of young people there compared with young people here in the United States. You expect high unemployment rates amongst the young in the United States because their problem is they've got to find a match. And anybody that's past the age of 30 and has already had a job, I mean, they first of all have to lose the job or want to quit the job before they enter unemployment. But for the young people, they're automatically going to enter it when they complete their schooling. They're going to be looking for a job, and not everybody can get a job in the same week or the same month, and that is what causes unemployment of young people to be higher than that of older people.
Your political observation was apparent in that slide that showed that it was the engineers that they're hoarding, and you could argue, so therefore it wouldn't work in the U.S. because we don't have any engineers anymore, right? But I think that, but really, notionally, it ought to affect services too if you think that the search costs are high. But that might suggest that there's a cap on the sort of social justice aspect of it, because presumably the people that you most want to help with a UI-like program are the people that, you know, don't have the high level of human capital that would make them hard to match to a job and make it costly to let them go.
No, I don't have a response to that point in particular. I did want to come back just for a moment to sort of the use of the word discrimination, just to underline a point. So usually when we say discrimination, of course, we mean not only some difference in treatment, but one motivated by, right, some internal, you know, some affective or cognitive issue. It's, you know, sort of attitude driven. And clearly that's one of the things I mean to point to, right, in referring to sort of these hidden unconscious biases. But there are many sources of discrimination. In some sense, it doesn't matter, certainly for the person affected, you know, what motivates the discrimination. The slides that I skipped over was pointing to the fact that the distribution of African Americans now and back in 1930 and 1940 is actually remarkably similar. Right, by and large, the same states, you know, the southeast and in the south that disproportionately hold African Americans now did so then, and we know that there are lots. You know, there's a pretty large literature around around the rise, the timing of the rise, and the content, the shape of the welfare state in general, right, in the United States, especially in comparison with what happened in Europe, and. You know, so Social Security, right? Much has been made of the fact that domestics and agricultural workers, who accounted for the great majority of the African American population, were excluded from Social Security initially. I think there isn't a consensus on whether or not that was about race per se. I recently came across an argument that it was really an administrative issue, but whether it's Social Security, whether it's, you know, felon disenfranchisement laws, where lots of states, especially in the South, in deciding what kinds of criminal activity were to be penalized with, you know, by having voting rights removed, in some states, they looked specifically at which crimes were most likely to be committed by African Americans as opposed to at the severity of crimes. And what I'm suggesting is it's conceivable that, and I just don't know the history, but it's certainly conceivable that unemployment insurance, that those same states who may have, right, for whom the racial makeup of their populations may have been a reason to install state unemployment systems that were less generous, that to the extent that that was true, and I don't know one way or the other, but again, we have some other examples where at least the argument can be made that that sort of historical imprint would continue to operate today with respect to the kinds of scatter plots I showed, because again, the population distribution hasn't changed a great deal, but that is a form of discrimination, if it exists, that wouldn't have anything to do in itself with contemporary attitudes around race.
Okay, question on the left.
Yes, I'm Frank Tedesco with the GAO. My question is for Andrew, and I wanted to ask you more about the data you talked about showing implicit bias in people. Two questions about the data in particular. One, I don't know how far back these types of studies go, but if they go back far enough, has there been any change over time, any diminishing of this effect over time, or has it been pretty steady? And the second question is, if we slice the data by age, are there differences, say, among the World War II generation, the baby boomers and the millennials, in how they score on those tests?
That's a great question. I think, the notion of implicit bias per se, as opposed to explicit bias, I think is not a very old one. I think some of the data collected here that I showed, collected again via internet, is probably, I'm guessing, mid-90s, right? It goes back to, it's probably about 15 years old, and there's probably some sort of social lab experiment counterparts to this that go back before that, maybe another 5 years. Incidentally, this version of this test have been administered to kids as young as 3, or I should say younger than that, but we start to see some of the sort of adult-like profiles on implicit bias as early as 3 years old. In terms of age, I'm trying to think if I know that. I do think, it's a tricky thing because, of course, this captures it at one point in time, right? Attitudes at one point in time, and attitudes around race and around many things, most things really aren't stable at all. So part of it is, context matters a great deal. A simple thing like, whether or not the subject, read about Martin Luther King, right, or watched Barack Obama on TV will yield a measurable difference in the results of these tests. I think it is true that there is greater correspondence between the implicit biases of older test takers and their explicit attitudes, and that younger test takers tend to show a bit less bias on average than older ones. But the only group, and some of you may have seen the study, the only group I'm aware of that consistently shows no bias are a group, and I'm going to forget what it is they have, but it's a group of children they tested who have some sort of genetic defect which prevents them from feeling social anxiety and fear under any circumstance. So these kids show the same sort of gender bias as any other kids at their same age, but no racial bias. So except for those young people, I think the rest of us have to deal with it.
Steve.
Steve Woodbury with Michigan State University and the Upjohn Institute. I have a question for Kevin Hassett. One explanation I've heard of the disuse of work sharing in the U.S. is that there are disincentives to use it on both the employer's side and the worker's side. On the worker's side, the benefit entitlement starts being used immediately, and that benefit entitlement, of course, is much less in the U.S. than in Germany, and workers would rather sort of hold that in reserve in case they're laid off. On the employer's side, the tax rate is experience rated, and the tax rate is likely to go up if work sharing is used. So I'm not sure I find either of those explanations wholly convincing, but I'm not sure what else there is, and what are your thoughts on it, and what could be done to increase the use of work sharing?
Yeah, for me, I think that there's also the fact that health insurance is provided I mean, it's a little hybrid there too, but if you think about it, with the benefit share of total costs being so high and wages only being replaced, then if you let one guy go, then you don't pay his wage and you don't pay his benefits. But if you keep 5 guys and cut their hours 20%, then you're paying benefits for all 5 guys. And in the U.S., that difference is big. You have to have a more generous program, obviously, if you want it to have the same take-up rate.
So a separate work sharing,
or include benefits in the formula or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Question on the left.
Hi, Tony Sarmiento with Senior Service America. I have 2 quick questions. First, for Andrew, first of all, thank you for bringing up that we still need to struggle over both personal bias and institutional policies that enforce sort of inequities. And so you're saying that, if I understand your last comment, it's only if we have a genetic problem that we're the only ones, that's the only way we escape, whether we're black or white or Asian, escape implicit racial bias. It's somehow in the air, it seems. But my question to you would be, when you suggest the idea of greater use of automation as one possible solution, I wonder if you've thought about the ongoing digital divide. So if you're older and have less income, less education, of a person of color, you're less likely to apply for UI online. So it may not reduce it too much. And for Kevin, I wonder if you've thought about the implications of work sharing for older workers. Thank you.
So thanks for that, Tony. So are we stuck with it? I mean, we're not stuck with it, but it's true that the work done on trying to fashion some effective responses to implicit bias is way, 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 way behind the work done on documenting the presence of implicit bias and its effects. But there are some things. At the broadest level, we know that it really, really makes sense to talk about race and ethnicity, right? To be explicit about it. The implicit stuff, tends to be the stuff that we're not too proud of, right? Or hopefully we're not too proud of it. It's the lesser angel stuff. The explicit stuff, right? There are certainly far more people who explicitly do, with all sincerity, believe there should be, racial egalitarianism and so on, as well as, on gender lines and other things, age lines. So in the most general, if you don't address it explicitly, you leave free the possibility of a pernicious effect happening. You need to lift it up and be straightforward about it. On the automation, I mean, I agree with the gentleman who was over here, his earlier point, that there's actually lots and lots to be said about automation, right? Lots and lots that can be lots of benefits that can accrue as well through not being automated and so on. But speaking strictly to the discretionary point, right, to the degree that you could do things that limit individual discretion, on that point it can be a plus, but maybe not worth in light of the minuses.
I know we're getting late, but I can say quickly that if you think of the old human capital model, kind of like Mincer, then the wage and the marginal product of the worker have kind of a life cycle pattern where I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but where the older worker has a lower marginal product relative to his wage, which would suggest that the firm would maybe be more willing to lay that person off. And so I guess running how that would interact with work sharing is complicated, but it might suggest that younger people who the firm really would prefer to hoard would be the folks that would benefit most.
I've been shown the sign that we have no time left, but I'm going to take one last question.
We're out of time.
We are out of time? Okay, we have no time left. I'm very sorry. Thank you very much, and I just have one comment left. There's an old German saying, Arbeit macht das Leben süß, which means work makes one's life sweet. For Kevin, I would say, Kurzarbeit macht das Leben süß. Dankeschön.
So we'd like to thank you, everyone. Thank you for the panelists.